Hi guys, so bit of a ramble I suppose. I did a little video on the way here to Worthing Hospital. I live on the south coast of England, and sort of still part of the introduction. I wanted to just touch on a bit of neurospiciness, if you like. I have long been a bit different, I suppose. Not helped by the fact that my mother is somewhat narcissistic and had always told me and everyone else just how clever I was. I was the blue-eyed blonde hair, not now, blue-eyed blonde hair boy, could do no wrong. Up until 18 months ago, 2 years ago, she maintained that I really enjoyed school. I had lots of friends, I was always active, and I left school with really good qualifications. Until I put her right and told her that I had a few select friends, very select friends. I spent most of my time on my own, apart from when I was with select friends. I detested school. Nothing, well no, that's not true, very little could keep me interested in school. The main thing that kept me interested in school was physics, actually. I really enjoyed physics, and I somewhat excelled. When the yardstick is another bunch of kids in what was the largest comprehensive school in Europe at the time. It was in the Guinness Book of Records for that at one point. So if your metric is a bunch of other kids from council estates in a very, very large school, you might think that I was doing well, but actually I wasn't. I detested it, hated it. And when I left school, I took my exams. I left school at 16. I took my CSEs and O-levels, as they were in the day. I failed miserably. One of the exams we had was humanities, and I had formed the opinion that it was my opinion versus the examiner's opinions, and because my opinions were a little bit radical, I made the decision that I wasn't going to take part in the game. So I attended the exam. I think it was a 2-hour exam. Sat in the main hall. I put my candidate number at the top of the paper, put my name at the top of the paper, and then I sat there for 2 hours and didn't do a thing, and I handed in an empty paper. I subsequently realised it's actually not about my opinions, it was about my thought process and how I assessed things, how I viewed the world and made my decisions about the world. That's what the humanities paper was about, not about did I agree with the liberal lefties that were all around the teaching system at the time. So I was a twat, absolute twat to myself. Although I'm not sure a CSE in those days, this is pre-GCSE, a CSE in those days in humanities would have changed things in my life very much at all, to be honest. So that was that. English, we had a written part, an examination, and we also had coursework to hand in. I handed in about 4 or 5 pieces of paper for an entire term's worth of coursework. Just there was no way I was ever going to achieve anything on that. I did engineering O-level, and I made some fundamental mistakes because I made assumptions about what was required. I didn't read the instructions properly, and consequently the piece of work that I put in failed. I mean, it worked. It was an oscillating engine, a single cylinder oscillating engine that you could run off compressed air, and it worked, but I failed to read the brief properly. I just dived in, did what I thought was right, and so I got an F in that subject, which I now realise is a classic ADHD trait. Maths, kind of okay. I had a very, very strict maths teacher, and to be honest, he was a very good maths teacher, but I didn't get the concepts. I still struggle with the concepts now. If I know why something happens in a particular way, then I'm okay with it, but I have to understand the why, not just the what. And that's with everything, that's not just with maths and things. I have to understand the why. So maths, I don't know, I got something like an E or something. I just didn't get it. The next thing was physics, and my exam was really good. I did really well in the exam, but my coursework again let me down. So I didn't do very well in physics, and I did an O-level in that, but because that was my favourite subject, but I failed effectively. And then the oddball was French. We had to learn a second language, and French was the compulsory language we all had to learn. So I did French, and I didn't do any of the paperwork for it at all. But we had an oral exam, and I turned up for the oral exam, and totally unprepared, and we had to choose a subject to talk about. And I chose a subject of something I'd never done until that point. Never. All I'd ever done was to see like out of town TV program, Jack Hawkins. So I chose fishing. I mean, I'd done a bit of lake fishing and in the streams and stuff as a kid, but I actually chose fly fishing, and I'd never ever done fly fishing in my entire life. I didn't know anything about it, but I was able to baffle and bullshit my way through in a bit of French, well, franglais, and I actually got a C in all French, which I thought was really interesting. The trouble with French for me is that you've got maybe 8 letters in a word, and you only pronounce 2 of them, and you've got to know which 2 and what gender they are. I find it really difficult, French, really, really difficult. Yet I was travelling to Germany regularly, because my company had an office there, and I was going there regularly, several times a year, and driving there, and I bought myself a cassette tape to play in the car to learn German. And I actually did a lot better in German, much, much better in German from that cassette tape and just using it. In fact, the first time I used it speaking to a German was to ask where the toilets were in a service station, and they answered me, and I was gobsmacked. So I managed to learn a little bit of German from that. But it all comes down to the teaching, I think, the methods of teaching. And back in the 60s and 70s, we didn't have like the SEN teaching now. One of my sons had it was called Independent Learning Support, ILS, and he would leave the regular lessons every now and then and go to have independent learning support, so the teachers could put together a plan for teaching him the way he needed to learn. Now it's SEN, special educational needs, but we didn't have that as a kid. When I was a kid at school, we had the normal classes, and then we had the remedials, and the remedials were where everybody else went, and all you had to try and do was to try and stay out of the remedials group. for some reason. I mean, it's just nonsense, absolute nonsense. When you look at it as an adult, the attitude that we had was just nonsense. But the remedials were in another classroom. They were actually in a hut outside. So whilst most of us were in the main building, the remedials were relegated to this bloody wooden hut. And that speaks volumes about the way teaching was then compared to now. There wasn't any identification of an individual's requirements to learn. And I had some good friends that went to the remedials hut, but because they were classed as remedials, everyone took the piss out of them. It was so unfair. But that's the way the teaching system was, so the teachers let them do it. At my school, as I say, it was a big school, and I went there in 1971, the first year I went to the lower school, and I stayed there to 76. But 1971 was a school uniform year. They'd introduced they had school uniform. So my parents bought me a school uniform. On the very first day, I sat away from everybody else. I was sitting against the wall of the building, and I was away from everybody else, and I just threw up all over myself, all over my school uniform. And I'm still embarrassed by it today, 54 years later. But at the end of that year, the school held a referendum for the pupils to decide whether or not they wanted school uniform. Well, you have to ask a bunch of 16-year-olds, 11 to 16-year-olds, do they want to put a school uniform on? I can tell you now, the answer's going to be no, they don't. I mean, it was a bit of a no-brainer, but they felt, the hippie teachers we had at the time felt that we all had to have a say. And so school uniform was abolished. So my parents had bought this school uniform, and then after 9 months or whatever, I would have grown out most of it anyway, but we were all down into casual clothes. You know, teachers were in casual clothes. I say we had a load of hangover hippies as teachers. And it all dropped into this concept of just be who you are. But it meant you didn't learn. Well, there were some people who were very academic, and I suppose I was one of the bully type kids who took the piss out of them because they were smart, but they were incredibly smart. And the truth be known, I was envious of them. I was envious of the fact that they got good results and they actually understood what was being told to them. And envy is a nasty trait, and as a teenager, if you're envious of another teenager, they get singled out, they get bullied. And truthfully, these guys were so far ahead of us that they probably should have been in a better school than the school we were in, I guess, because it couldn't cater for the really, really bright and the guys who were struggling. So my mum thought I was doing really well at school, thought I was a bloody genius, thought I was enjoying it all, thought I had lots of friends and everything else. So about 15 years ago, my second wife, we'd had some issues and some problems and things, and she asked me one day if I thought I might have Asperger's syndrome, which is kind of autistic traits, but it's not full on what a lot of people would recognise as autism. So being the sort of person I am, I researched it, and I researched it, and I researched it, and I did loads of online testing, and as far as I'm concerned, I had Asperger's. After about a year or so, I started seeing a psychologist because I'd had a breakdown, a complete breakdown. I made a lot of very bad judgment calls, big mistakes. I hurt a lot of people, and I had a complete breakdown. So I was actually sitting there one day, I was literally staring at the clouds, and my wife at the time said, "Look, you need some help." And together we found someone who would see me the following day, privately. So that's what I did, and I've been seeing that person now, that psychologist, for almost 15 years. She said I didn't have Asperger's. She didn't say what I did have, but she didn't say it. She said I didn't have Asperger's. I wasn't an Aspie. But I put in for an assessment, a formal assessment, which was supported by my GP. But part of the assessment is the assessors interview family, and they decided to interview my mother. And what they learned from my mother was that I was the perfect blue-eyed, blonde-haired boy who everybody loved and lived for life, really intelligent, really caring, thoughtful, outgoing, had friends, loads of friends and everything else, and it was all bullshit. And what it did was it actually destroyed the assessment, because even though they'd met me and they had come to conclusions about me as me, my mother's assessment or my mother's input undid everything. Anyway, moved forward along a lot of years. Me and my wife got divorced. I live on my own, and 6 years ago I managed to secure an assessment for autistic spectrum disorder, ASD, and I had a couple of meetings with a psychiatrist, 2 psychiatrists actually, and a psychiatric nurse, so 3 professionals, and they all concurred that I had ASD. I'd lost years and years because of my mother's desire to portray me as the poor, perfect child. And who knows, I might not have even lost my marriage. Who knows? Anyway, more currently, I have, again through my GP, she's done assessments on me, and she believes that an ADHD assessment is warranted. And I think my ADHD side of things is much more prevalent, much stronger than the ASD. The ADHD stops me in my tracks from progressing. I have 1,001 projects on the go at any one time, and they almost never get finished because I go so far down one, and I'm a researcher. When it comes to a project, I'm in there, I'm all over it. I find out everything about it, and I become that bore that can talk about it, bore the arse off of everyone, and then all of a sudden, pop, I find something else, and that thing no longer exists. Whatever it was that I was researching and working on and doing no longer exists. It's just gone, doesn't exist, and now I'm doing exactly the same thing on something else. At the moment, I'm heavily into preserving food and pressure canning, water bathing and pressure canning my food, dehydrating. I bought myself a really good dehydrator. I've ordered a pressure canner. I grow a lot of my own food, but it could quite easily disappear tomorrow if something else comes along, and I've learned everything I need to learn about something, and it's gone, and I don't actually then have to continue with it. So I waste money on things, and I'll have all this stuff that I then got to get rid of because I won't ever use it, and I'm researching and doing something else. So the ADHD side of things is really, really difficult. You find yourself, like today I had an appointment at 3 o'clock at the hospital. I couldn't do anything all day. The whole day I couldn't start anything because I had this appointment at 3 o'clock. I had to leave my house for 2:15. Like anybody else would do, I would have been able to do things up until about 1:30, 1 o'clock, have some lunch, and then get ready for my appointment. But no, that's not how ADHD works. The whole day is written off because you've got an appointment at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So you get nothing, absolutely nothing done. And then there's the other extreme where I had to put my VAT return in on the 7th of August for my business, and I had everything in place to do it. I had everything, all my ducks were in a row, ducks I didn't even know I had, but they were all in a row. And then everything stopped on about the 4th or 5th. Everything stopped, and I finally submitted my VAT return, bear in mind if you don't get it in by the end of the 7th of the month it's due, if you don't get it in by then, you get a fine and you're risking getting a visit from the VAT man. So it's quite serious. About 11:15 at night, I finally pressed the submit button on my VAT return. And that's classic ADHD. You just leave it and leave it and leave it and leave it and leave it. You've got time blindness, effectively. You don't know that you need to get it done, and you can get it done with plenty of time and have no stress. Because that's not how the brain works with ADHD. With ADHD, it don't matter. None of these problems exist until all of a sudden you've got to go flat bloody out to get it done. And it's always been observed by colleagues of mine that I work much better when I'm under pressure for time. And I didn't know that that was an ADHD trait until about 18 months ago, maybe 2 years ago. All of the traits that I exhibit and feel are ADHD traits. So we'll see what happens with the assessment. Anyway, I've ranted for 20 minutes or so. I'm now home from the hospital. I'm just about 600 yards from my house. And I think I've probably bored the arse off of you by now, if you are actually watching this. Like I say, I'm not doing it for anyone but me, but if you are watching it, thanks for sticking around. There'll be more of this nonsense later. Okay, cheers.